I found India to be very hierarchical. And the consequence of that was you'd have silos created. So one of my big focus areas was to create teamwork, create the structures, the reward systems, to celebrate team wins.
Dr. Arun Kumar is the managing partner of Celesta Capital,
former chairman and CEO of KPMG India,
and former assistant secretary of commerce under President Obama.
In his book, The Global Trade Paradigm, he explores the evolution of global value chains and their geopolitical implications.
When I wrote my book, The Global Trade Paradigm, I was lamenting the fact that the world was becoming closed. Countries have to protect their strategic interests, one of which is technology. And now in venture capital, I'm leaning forward, in my view, to develop the India deep tech ecosystem aims to solve complex challenges.
If you had to distill everything you have learned about leadership across all of these chapters into one thing, what would it be?
It's about the importance of...
Hi everybody, welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leaders Show. Today, I'm super excited to have with me a super guest. He's Dr. Arun Kumar, managing partner of Celesta Capital and former chairman and CEO of KPMG in India. He's also former assistant secretary of commerce under President Obama, and he studied Tata Administrative Service at age 20 alongside Ratan Tata, and studied at MIT, he's law MBA, and is author of The Global Trade Paradigm and 2 books of poetry. We'll come back to why poetry is important in leadership. So, Arun, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
I'm great to be here, Andrea.
So, Arun, I mean, your story is fascinating, as most of the story of people that are passing by this show. You grew up wanting to study physics, if I remember correctly, and you won a national scholarship for it. And then at 20 years old, you ended up working alongside Ratan Tata before anyone knew who Ratan Tata would become. What happened? How does a physics student ended up in business?
You know, I'd say, Andrea, as it often happens, a lot is because of chance.
Yes.
Graduating from the University of Kerala in Trivandrum. And around that time, the head of the Tata Administrative Service Office, he had visited Kerala and he met the vice chancellor of my university. And he said, suggest a few names that I can talk to about the TAS. And I was one of those names. I then went through the selection process and got appointed into TAS. And that's where the story begins, so to speak.
Yeah. And what did you learn from, so when, I mean, if we move forward, 35, when you're already working for Ratan Tata, what did you learn from that experience, the age you couldn't have learned from any business school? What was a revelation from that experience, if anything?
I think he was my first boss. So I was 20, he was 35. I was assigned to work with him in my very first assignment in TAS. And it was quite fascinating for me to work with him because he had at that age already seen quite a lot. He was a graduate of Cornell, had been an architect, a structural engineer. He'd worked in London, in Australia, in the steel plant in Jamshedpur in India, and so forth. So what struck me about him, a number of attributes. One was his curiosity. He was always interested in learning. And what I found was that when he learned something, he could change his mind about something. You know, sometimes people get stuck and think they know the answers, but he was somebody who could change his mind when he learned something new and acquired new insights. The second was that he was trained as an engineer, so he was analytical and very scientific in his approach to problems. So, I come from a physics background, and I didn't think the world of business had much to do with science, but I could see the way he approached problems was truly scientific. Another thing about him, he was trained as an architect, so he was an aesthete, and he had a sense of style because of his architectural training. As a leader, I think what was most striking was he was a very careful listener. So very often, in business, you're sitting in meetings where someone's running the meeting and they're doing all the talking.
Yes.
This was the opposite. He did the least talking, the most listening. But when he talked with, carefully and with clarity of direction, and everybody knew where you wanted to go. I said so many fascinating aspects of Mr. Tata. Another was his humility, which was evident even then. I mean, it was a very endearing quality to see his genuine humility.
Yeah.
And he was very open to ideas. And I was 20 years old, and if I had an idea, he would welcome it. He would encourage thinking, and he himself could think big. He could think from first principles. He could think out of the box. And in fact, I'll tell you this little story. Many years later, I'm in the Obama administration, and I visit India, and there's a reception at the U.S. ambassador's house in Delhi, and Mr. Tata is one of the guests, and my boss, Secretary of Commerce Penny Prisker, is there, and he tells that secretary that, you know, Arun was one of my ideas people. So he liked the fact that people would come up with ideas to explore.
Hmm.
A special compliment.
So, I mean, just to, I mean, not everybody probably knows in the audience, but who was Ratan Tata at that time?
So at that time, he was running a small company within the Tata Group. It was his first stint as the CEO of a company. But from then on, he essentially became, eventually, many years later, maybe 15, 20 years later, 15 years later, he became the chairman. Well, like when I started with him, it was 20 years later, he became the chairman of the entire group. And he was a very transformative chairman. He took the Tata Group into many global initiatives, made Tata Steel global. He bought Jaguar Land Rover, bought bought Tetley, and merged with the Tata Tea.
He created an empire.
And
Essentially, he is
a
an empire.
global business. He took a national enterprise and made it a global enterprise.
So it's fascinating. The reason why, I want to, spend even 1 minute more about it, because we're talking about one of the most extraordinary leaders in terms of the evolution of the business that he created, from a very small company to a conglomerate, to a huge, a giant organization. So what you shared a little bit earlier, the idea of the fact that he was so keen to listen, so keen to be curious. I mean, I wouldn't underestimate what you just shared, because I mean, in a world of command and control of leaders, they always have something to say, they always have the answer. A leader like that, he became who became at the end. I think it's such a great insight in terms of how can leaders should show up in the system, which is not a traditional way how we think about leaders should show up. Now, if we move, forward your story, which again is so fascinating, and we'll come back to your experience as in KPMG in India when you started to lead them. But before that, there was an important chapter of your life when you essentially, after decades in Silicon Valley, so moving fast forward and already working with KPMG, you got a call from another important person, from Obama administration, and they wanted you to lead US trade promotion globally. I think you're, if I'm not mistaken, 1,700 people, 78 countries, 50 states. So what was it like to go from being a business leader, to representing an entire country?
I'd say it was a very high honor. And in fact, I recall my first Senate committee hearing, which was chaired by the patrician Senator J. Rockefeller. And in those my remarks, I recalled how I, as a young student, would read in the US Information Systems Library in Trivandrum stories of people like Jefferson and Madison and Lincoln, and being captivated by the principles that created a new nation. So at that time, nor when I landed in Boston as a student many years later, would I have imagined that I would represent the United States as a diplomat
Incredible.
and lead a global bureau of the US government. So it was really quite special. And it was also a very special experience when I actually got into it. I traveled to some 30 countries, led trade missions, participated in various trade dialogues. I met many impressive leaders around the world. I got to meet Prime Minister Modi when he visited the US in 2014, and then again the next year. And I met a number of other leaders. For example, one of the leaders who's now very prominent in Europe is Alexander Stubb, President of Finland. I met him when he was a trade minister. In fact, I met him my very first week in the
Oh,
job
wow.
at Commerce. So you just meet a variety of fascinating people, which is one of the big benefits of that job.
But you were born in India. I mean, you are Indian, as we are not we're foreigners in our own country where we live, etc. And you were now the face of the American commercial diplomacy. By the way, there is no any problem with that. But still, did the duality ever create tension for you, or was it the reason they choose you? I mean, the different thinkings. What do you think was the behind that choice?
I'd say having the experience of um, two countries is often better than having the experience of only one country.
Mm,
So I believe that America was very welcoming. I didn't feel that I didn't belong. At the
yes.
same time, I valued my heritage, having been born in India. This worked out very nicely because in 2014, when Prime Minister Modi was elected in India, the relationship between India and the US had kind of been a little moribund for a while. And
Mm,
both sides saw that as an opportunity to revive the relationship. And since I was very familiar with India, that KPMG had led the US India practice for KPMG US, I would come to India frequently. I knew the business leaders, I knew many the political leaders. It turned out that I was the right place at the right time to be able to help from the US side build the US India relationship. Now, it also, when you say duality, there are also some odd occurrences. For instance, when I and a colleague of mine, also of Indian origin, she was the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, we were testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. One of the congressmen thought that since we were brown skinned, we must be representing the government of India, and that turned out
mm,
a bit of an incident. Fortunately, I didn't think much of it, but it got a lot of attention in the press, and John Oliver picked it up on his comedy show, and so we were both involuntary participants in his comedy show. But it got a lot of attention. But that goes to the point that duality cannot be taken for granted.
mm.
People have to become sensitive to the fact that you have in a country people coming from of different origin and how they all can work together. It should not be stereotyped based on name or skin color or whatever.
Agreed. Agreed. Such a great words from you, Aaron. By the way, you mentioned a topic that is important. The fact that when because you played a key role in elevating the U.S. India relationship. When Modi just became prime minister. Now, in a world where we live right now, where there is no trust between countries, and we experience that, right? You don't trust the wars, you don't trust the action that war starts. So let's not even get there. But what does it mean building trust between countries? And that's I think is a good parallel when it comes to organization to the business. Mm, Trust is missing right now inside of many organizations. Trust in the leadership, but also leaders trusting their own people. What does it mean building trust in your experience after having been through a very critical relationship diplomacy at that time?
That's a very important topic, and today we are seeing a huge drop in trust levels.
Yes.
I think there are many elements to building trust. One is to be able to find the points of agreement, the points of alignment, where both countries can work jointly towards common goals and trusting each other to do their part to work towards those common goals. It often means a fair amount of give and take, but on balance, each country is looking out for its own interests appropriately.
Mm,
And there are ways to make it very, very successful because so many interests are complementary. Often one country has something to offer that the other country doesn't, and vice versa. But it has to be talked about and discussed in an atmosphere of openness and with a commitment to create a win-win outcome. I think that, in my view, would be most important. And we have to be seeking win-win outcomes where everybody is better off at the end by working together.
yeah, it's all of that. It's all about that. Is the win-win? Is doing something for others, not just doing something for yourself. I think that's such a solid, a strong foundation of building trust. Now, if we now look at your to what happened after the Obama administration ended. I mean, you were asked to go back to India and lead, a major organization, so KPMG. How many people were at KPMG at that time when you joined?
So when I joined KPMG India, we had about 10,500 people focused on the Indian market. We had others focused on outside markets.
Yes.
My focus was the Indian market. And then when I left, we had 26,000 people. So we grew it pretty significantly over 5
Massive.
years.
Yeah, massive organization. So, completely new challenge, leading so many people, but also leading as a CEO, but also going back to your own country after 39 years. I think you've been out of the country,
Got
right?
39.
I mean, so many things changing for you at the same time. Or what looked like at that time to be a person in charge in a completely new experience for you.
You know, Bombay, Mumbai is where I started my career working in the TAS. And so 39 years later, I was returning to Mumbai. And I have to tell you that I was reminded of famous words of T.S. Eliot, where he says, at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. In many
Right.
ways, this is
Interesting.
true of my return. It was really a rediscovery. So it was great to get re engaged and to understand the country and people uh, after a pretty long absence. Even though I've been in touch, it's different when you're plunged into it and you're living there every day.
And I mean, is it fair to say that, look, I'm Italian. I live in the UK. I've been living outside of my country for more than 20 years. So, as much as I love going back to my own country, but I appreciated that if at some point somebody is gonna ever ask me to lead an Italian organization, I will feel like yes, to some extent, because it's my origin, my root, it's my culture, my country. But at the same time, I also will think something like, am I good fit for that? Did I change a lot from an identity standpoint, from a set of values, practice, ways of working, leadership? It would be good enough, or it will be totally different than what they're asking for, what they were expecting. Has any of that came to mind when you were at that time, you were thinking about how shall I approach this new role? Am I too now American, or I'm Indian enough to lead a large organization with a lot of Indian people?
I think I had a good understanding of India, uh, even though I've been living abroad. But there were some areas that struck me as quite different from what I was used to in America. One, for instance, was that I found India to be very hierarchical. Organizations were very hierarchical. So you could sit in a meeting and the junior people may not speak up and senior people
Yes.
are speaking. It could even happen in a board meeting. The chairman of the board does all the speaking and everybody's just listening. So I found that the hierarchical nature really struck me very hard. I also found that maybe as a consequence of that, people like to have a lot of people under them. So in an organization, you measured yourself by how many people you had under you, as
Yes.
opposed to what difference you made. In Silicon Valley, if you make a successful product, that's more important than having hundreds of thousands of people. Similarly, in the consulting business, if your client is successful, that's more important than having lots of people. So I found that the hierarchical nature of the culture and kind of a sense that you should have a lot of people, I found that a bit strange. And the consequence of that was then you'd have silos created. Each one who had people under him didn't want
Yes.
their people to work with
Yes.
the other people. And today, in today's world, almost everything requires teamwork. These are not, solo sports. So one of my big focus areas was to create teamwork, was to promote teamwork, and to really create the structures, the reward systems, the measurements that pushed teamwork, to celebrate team wins. So I think teamwork was a very major focus for me, which was really a reaction to the fact that there was too many silos and too many hierarchies. I tried to create structures that cut across hierarchies, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, I would be interesting to hear maybe one insight in terms of how did you do that. And the only reason I'm asking, because what you experienced so many years ago is not unfortunately as different as what I see in many organizations where the silos mentality still prevails. Not necessarily because there is a culture of isolation, but I think it's more about as a product of people that get so much either busy, tactical, reacting. So that's forcing our self-protective mechanism, our way of survival to some extent. And normally, when people get in survival, in my experience, is not normally when the silos mindset get aggravated because people feel like, well, let me look at my own first so I can be secure and then or safe, and then I can look at the other. So it's interesting because I mean, your was more about the hierarchy, the product of hierarchy and how the structure, how the business was structured. But you recall maybe one single thought, action, practices that you built to make it much more collaborative and making sure there was more systemic thinking versus silos.
Yes, yes, many. So that organization was organized by, to keep it simple, line of business. So three major lines of business, and under them other lines of business. I created structures that could go across lines of business. For example, uh, an office managing partner, office where all these different businesses resided. The office managing partner's role was to stitch them together to face clients, was to get them together to win big engagements. So that was one structure that I created. And the office managing partner would have a say in the evaluation of the people in the office, in addition to their line bosses, so to speak.
Got it.
So the line of business person would have a say, so will the office managing partner. That was one. Another was to create a structure whereby everybody would be rewarded by the totality of the results. So at the end of each year, you evaluate everyone, and based on that evaluation, they get their target compensation set for the next year. At the end of the next year, you look at the collective performance of the firm, and everybody's compensation will go up or down depending on the collective performance of the firm. So it essentially says that everybody's vested in working together in advancing the collective performance of the firm. So the examples of comp structures, examples of org structures, and then how you celebrate the wins. Uh, all these are examples of getting people to cross lines and work together.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think they're successful. In my view, those really worked out very well because we found that while when I came, we might a team might go to dinner to celebrate $100,000 win. Soon they were going out to dinner only when they were winning $1 million or $10 million. So the game changed when people started working together.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, celebrating wins to me is one of the things that's totally misunderstood or underestimated by leaders, in my experience. There is always this tendency, Aaron, to declare what is missing, but never really a culture of celebration. And that is not just about good for the morale, for the engagement. I think it's good for performance because people started to see that things are working and there's no opportunity to get behind, right?
Right? And you get to know each other better. Teams get to know
Yeah,
people. And
exactly.
Andrea, all of this is transparency. People should know where they stand, where the team stands. So having constant feedback on how the firm is doing, what are the metrics, not sugarcoating things, providing facts as they are. I think that's a very important element because you have teamwork and you have transparency, then I believe those two lead to trust.
Oh, totally. And again, look, you just said the word transparency. Now, is there anything less structural but more in terms of the way how you show up, the way you communicate it, the way something that you created that allow people to be much more transparent, honest with each other? Because in a culture where it's not just your own experience, but in many other cultures, it's really hard to build what we all call now psychological safety. Amy Edmondson, coined that word. But the reality is making sure people can, you know, openly say what is really in their mind. Is there anything that you consider as a best possible thinking or strategy to allow people to be much more open with each other?
I think one is just enhancing the amount of communication. So
Mm.
constantly talking about where one stood. When I was in my US government job, every Sunday night, I would write a letter to all the 1,700 people in the organization talking about what happened the previous week. So I shared things that I came across my desk, everything important. And then there'd be lots of information I would get that I thought everybody can see. So I would make that available to everybody. So that was sharing a lot of information. We also shared key metrics every week of where things stood to the whole organization. So they could see where they stood, where other teams stood. So it also creates a certain sense of competition in a healthy way. So transparency, sharing information, and doing that constantly and consistently, I think is very important. In terms of what you talked about, people working together and trusting each other, I think that really comes out of teamwork when people are going to win projects or deliver outcomes working together. In my view, that kind of trust develops.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely is my experience too. Now, let's look at the future or maybe more into the present. I mean, you are now a managing partner at Celesta Capital, and you're investing in deep tech across the US and India, which is no surprise. Now, for those leaders and CEOs primarily listening who don't necessarily live into the VC world, what is deep tech and why should they care? Why is it important right now?
Okay, deep tech refers to innovations that are based on substantial scientific discoveries and advanced engineering. So, deep tech aims to solve complex challenges, and those solutions come from knowledge that's based on years of intensive research, specialized talent, and also what we provide, knowledgeable capital. So this is different from consumer investing, which is consumer facing e-commerce, or many software sectors even that have seen a
Yes.
lot of investment and growth recently. Deep tech just calls for a lot more understanding of technology. Often you're making decisions before you actually see the product market fit. So you're making a judgment that this technology will work and it will actually lead to productive demand. So it's different in that sense. Oftentimes, lead time is longer in deep tech. So it needs patient capital. It needs investors who are willing to be
Mm,
patient and work with entrepreneurs. So that's deep tech. And what we do at Celesta Capital, we focus in certain areas: semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, aerospace, the convergence of biology and computer science that we call bioconvergence. And we've been investing for over a decade in AI at various levels, all the way from semiconductor level to specialized applications. So that's what deep tech is about, and that's what we do. And we believe that we are on the threshold of huge opportunities that will dwarf what we saw at the advent of the .com of the internet era. So it's entering an age of great promise.
yeah. Then absolutely. What drove interest in deep tech? I mean, you're coming from, I mean, I would say, but, to simplify the tax world, and work clearly for a major consulting firm. It was more about the creating the US India corridor, technology corridor. So that was the driver, or the driver was your own interest about, deep tech, I mean, technology at that level.
I would say both. Certainly, I was very familiar with the India US corridor from my days at KPMG and from my days in the US Department of Commerce. So that was very well understood. I lived in Silicon Valley for 4 decades, so I knew that part extremely well. So that was given. But going back early in my career, I'd been a high tech entrepreneur. I'd co founded a supercomputer company based on a new architecture with a computer architect friend of mine. And I then subsequently co-founded a network management software company. So I was familiar uh, with technology as an entrepreneur. Uh, This was when I first went to Silicon Valley. For several years, I was involved in that, um, and then I later been uh, a mentor to many startups, an angel investor in some of them. So I'd been in the technology game for a long time. So that plus my knowledge of the corridor and my seeing the opportunities that are developing now in deep tech, made it just very
It's a
interesting.
great.
area
It's a
together.
great it's a great cocktail for success. And talking about that, India's being positioned as a third global tech hub alongside the US and China, which is quite interesting data to explore. You think that is real or is more an ambition, given how much you know now the India market?
No, I think it's real. Today, all the high tech companies in the West, whether it's in Europe or in America, they all have capability centers in India,
Mm,
employing hundreds of thousands of people. And they're not doing back office work, they're actually doing design work and product work. So these very engineers, just like the engineers in Silicon Valley, some of them will say, why don't I do for myself rather than build it for a large company? So that's fertile ground for entrepreneurship to come up. So that will expand the scheme. Second, the number of technology institutions in India have really multiplied in terms of numbers of engineers produced in India. It's very large. So this, and the government in the country is very committed to deep tech. And they're really leaning forward in a very big way for India in the technology area. Uh, Finally, there's a tendency around the world to be conscious of technology sovereignty. That you do not
mm,
want to be dependent on other countries for critical technologies. And it's become very clear, very, very clear in the last few years. In fact, when I wrote my book, The Global Trade Paradigm, I was lamenting the fact that the world was becoming closed. And I pointed to Brexit and many other instances. But today, the world has become even more closed than it was when I wrote that book just 3 years ago. In that scenario, countries have to protect their strategic interests, one of which is technology.
yes.
Always going to push India to become certainly a third power in technology.
Well, great. Well, we will definitely welcome that. Now, shifting from technology to something totally unrelated, which is, I know, is one of your main passions, is poetry. It's quite interesting, right? For those people that don't know you, say, well, I mean, you've been, a major, big, company leaders. You work for the Obama administration. Important conversation about foreign policy, diplomacy. Then you led as a CEO as a KPMG. Yet, you have published two books of poetry. And I have to ask, what does a Silicon Valley VC and former diplomat need poetry for?
For me, I've always loved the world of words. So I've been writing, from a very young age, quite a lot. And I particularly like poetry. I was
Hmm.
inspired by my father, who enjoyed poetry, by a
Okay.
teacher in high school. But some 15 years ago, I showed my poems to a friend of mine, who's now very famous, the writer Abraham Verghese. And when he saw them, he said, you should publish these. And so I did get a publisher and I published them. And in fact, when the book came out, he very graciously hosted the very first reading, which was at Stanford. So, I had been interested in poetry, just in the world of words. And I'm glad I could keep that going and publish two books.
So I need to ask. Is there a poem that you have written that captures something about leadership that maybe a business book never could? I mean, I just written my business book, sorry, and they'll come up, in October. But I'm sure there is something that you have written that hasn't been considered in business book. So what that could be? I mean, it's something that you would like to share, maybe one of them.
Let me share a poem that applies to business. I'm just put it
Okay.
out here. In business, in accounting, there's this process called the close process. At the end of the month, close the books, reconcile all the
Yeah.
accounts,
Yes,
and
we're all
report
familiar
the
with
end
that.
year closing process. So I was sitting in a room in San Francisco watching a colleague of mine teach people how to improve the closing process.
Okay.
He happened to be someone who studied philosophy, and then it was really fascinating to hear the way she was teaching people about the closing process. So I wrote a poem about that. I'll read that out.
Okay.
It's
Looking
called
forward to it.
Life's, it's called Life's Accounting.
Okay.
Martin. A student once of Latin, Greek, the classics, she expounds upon accounting methods in terms fundamental, the basics of making smooth the closing process, of aging accounts unreconciled, of measuring failure and success. Outside, an eagle soars among skyscrapers, Lego stacked against a deep blue sky, distracting me from her talk of ledgers. The Bay Bridge spans azure waters, the smooth hills of the Diablo range beyond. But let's now focus on period end matters, aging, reconciling, closing.
Ah, it's beautiful. Congratulations. Congratulations. It's so great. I mean, where did you get this inspiration for? I mean, you said your father, etc. But is it something that comes to mind even, while you're listening to something, when you're in a conversation, in your head, you started to think about, well, there could be a poem there. What's your thinking process?
Yeah, my theory is that poems, you just get them. They're like photographs. You see a moment, and the moment has something to offer. And I really think about a poem as something that captures a moment in time, really like a photograph, at least to my mind, like a photograph. And when you take a photograph, and I enjoy photography, you're looking for something unusual. So in my poetry, I say that I'm looking for the unusual in the usual, and the usual in the unusual.
That's very good. That's very nice. I love that. Definitely love that. All right, so we're getting to close of this conversation, Aaron. So, in summary, I mean, you have 5 careers at least, 3 continents, from Tata to Obama to Silicon Valley, then back to KPMG India. If you had to distill everything you have learned about leadership across all of these chapters into one thing, and if you have two, is fine. But what would it be?
And I don't know if I can put into one thing, but what I can share is what I learned in each of these places.
Mm,
But in the Tata organization, I think I learned the importance of purpose. That a business is not just about the bottom line; it's about being committed to
purpose.
the country, to communities. And they really, Tata Group really has believed in that for 150 years or so. So that I certainly, the importance of purpose, which again came to life in other places where I worked. Second, the importance of decency. I mean, the Tatas were very keen that the way they conducted their business and the way they dealt with their people was always with decency, with respect,
Mm,
never diminishing others. So I think I learned, from there I learned
wow.
those 2 points, purpose and decency. In Silicon Valley, I learned the importance of working with the brightest. Your
Mm,
game gets better when you work with extremely bright people. When I came to KPMG India, this is what I told people: hire people who are better than you. Hire someone whom you'll be happy to work for. So I think that's a key lesson. In the US government, I learned the importance of building coalitions, collaborating across departments, working as a team, across multiple interests. And I think that's a key to public service. You have to work across very, very different groups of people. And in KPMG India, my lesson was different. It was about leaning forward to help. So one year when I was leading the firm, there was a cyclone in Kerala, which is catastrophic.
mm,
And we
mm,
said we will send our talented people to come and help manage. We just said to do it pro bono. And then later, when COVID struck, we said the same thing to the Union Ministry of Health and Logistics. We'll send our people. And so at the time that there was a need, we leaned forward and helped. And actually, that turned out to be good for us because our people learned new skills, new
yes.
capabilities, and that, in fact, enhanced our business as well. And now in venture capital, I'm leaning forward, in my view, to develop, along with my colleagues, to develop the deep tech ecosystem in the country. Or leaning forward, we're working with other firms to stand up the India Deep Tech Alliance to develop the India Deep Tech ecosystem. So I think these are the various lessons from the different organizations. But if I would put one thread through, actually come to think of it, your question about one lesson, It's about the an importance of a cultural fluency where you can stitch different aspects together, you know, different contexts and intentions, whether it's in the situation room in Washington or a boardroom in Mumbai or a Silicon Valley or Bangalore startup. Stitching these different things together requires a certain degree of ability to move in different worlds, what I might call, cultural fluency or organizational fluency. I think that might be the common thread through all of this.
It's definitely a common thread, and I'm grateful that you share these lessons or your about leadership, because to me that resonates a lot, and I'm particularly hit by the element of decency. I'm so proud that you said that. I'm so happy because it's something that, especially during crisis or moment of uncertainty, the first thing that leaders lose is the decency of respecting people, the decency of communicating openly with people, the decency of being a good people, which I think is, is the
Yeah,
foundation of every
yeah.
relationship.
And sometimes people think that being decent, you're being soft or weak. I don't believe so. I think
I am
uh,
with you.
it's actually a sign of strength. And you're
Absolutely. Perfectly said. So thank you for that final comment, Aaron. So last question, your career has been about crossing borders multiple times. Countries, industries, sectors, identities to some extent. We touched on it. So what's the next border you want to cross? If there's anything else in your list
right
of
now.
desire.
I'm looking forward to working with ambitious young entrepreneurs, but I'm also looking forward to perhaps writing a book, maybe a playbook for more interconnected economic future, because what's going on today is quite distressing. And hopefully another book of poetry or a book of essays.
So a lot of new borders to cross.
Anyway,
And that's great. So fantastic. So Aaron, thank you so much for being the show. It's been such an incredible and pleasant conversation, as I hoped. So, where people should go if you don't want to know more about you, Aaron?
yeah, but that's not up to date. I need to make it. It's arunmkumar.com. But afraid it's
Great,
not up to date.
and that's where they can see more poems too, or
You can see some poems. You can see some of my interviews and other
okay, great,
writings. But yeah,
great, perfect. Well, thanks again, Aaron, for being with me today. I totally appreciate it. And you are in India right now; it's quite late, so again, I appreciate it again for your availability and flexibility.
no, greatly enjoyed it, Andrea. Thank you for having me.